Okay, picture this. It's dawn over the Margalla Hills in Islamabad, May 7th, 2025. Maybe you're like the engineer in our source material, looking over some dense report about AI and warfare. Cup of tea right there. Steaming away.
Exactly. And then you hear it, not just one jet, but a whole formation, like screaming supersonic right over the city.
Wow.
Glasses rattle, car alarms go off. You run out onto the terrace.
Yeah, you'd have to see what's going on.
And you see them, PAF, JF-17, Thunders banking hard, J-10Cs right behind them, sun glinting off the sensors. And it hits you. This is not a drill.
And it wasn't. That morning, that was Pakistan's first high alert scramble in something totally new.
Right.
The incredibly short but really historic India-Pakistan AI conflict of 2025.
4 days, wasn't it?
Just 4 days. But in that time, South Asia's militaries basically road-tested the next generation of AI warfare for the whole world to see.
So those jet sounds, the afterburners, that was more than just noise. It was carrying data trails. Oh, absolutely. We're talking sensor fusion, auto-target cues, even battle group chatbots running so fast, human radio operators just couldn't keep up.
And that engineer, watching those jets climb,
Yeah.
they had this realization, didn't they?
Yeah, a profound one. The algorithms they've been studying, they weren't just like back office support anymore. They were actively guiding pilots, choosing drone routes, directly shaping global risk in real time.
The source put it really well. AI moved from being a support tool to being the second officer on the flight deck.
And sometimes the one calling the shots. Exactly. The AI had jumped from the lab, from the whiteboard.
Right into the cockpit.
Right into the command tent. And yeah, straight onto the firing line. Fundamentally different.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. Because we've heard about drone warfare, cloud computing, smart weapons for years, right? That stuff isn't entirely new.
True.
So based on the sources you've dug into, what specifically made those 4 days in 2025 so different? Why was this such a big deal?
Well, the sources really point to 3 things coming together all at once. First one was mature, affordable autonomy.
Okay.
Think about things like NVIDIA Jetson-class boards. The price on those just plummeted.
Right.
We're talking well under $200.
Right.
So you combine that low cost with vision models trained on satellite images that are pretty easy to get, and suddenly your basic quadcopter can fly really complex routes all by itself, like hugging terrain to stay hidden.
So the sheer affordability changed everything. Commanders could actually use these things without worrying constantly about losing expensive kit.
Exactly. It just changed the whole calculation. So that's one. Cheap hardware enabling smart solo flight.
Got it. What was number 2?
Second, you saw the rise of global chips meeting local doctrine.
Meaning?
Meaning regional players like India and Pakistan, they weren't waiting around for the big U.S. defense firms or Silicon Valley anymore. Thanks to, a decade of open source tech and accessible components, you had Pakistani engineers integrating Chinese flight controllers with their own locally developed path planning software.
Okay.
Indian startups were tweaking Israeli loitering munitions so they'd work perfectly with the Indian Air Force's existing comms links.
So everyone was kind of rolling their own, mixing and matching.
Pretty much a real DIY approach, blending globally available tech with their deep local operational smarts.
Okay, that makes sense. And the third factor?
This one's maybe the most unsettling: information engines on steroids.
Right, the narrative warfare aspect.
Yeah, but supercharged. The sources talk about GPT-level AI models churning out multilingual propaganda, spin, disinformation at incredible speed.
So faster than humans could track or debunk.
Way faster. Think about it. A shell lands somewhere. Almost instantly, there's an echo on social media, video clips, posts, whatever, amplified by bots designed specifically to find and push emotional buttons.
Creating chaos.
Total chaos. The narrative war became incredibly fast, often completely detached from what was actually happening on the ground.
Okay, so let's recap. Cheap, adaptable, autonomous drones in the physical world, combined with super fast, AI-driven information warfare online.
Exactly.
Which means AI wasn't just helping out anymore. It was like an independent player in the fight.
A direct participant, yeah, for sure.
Okay, so let's walk through how those 4 days actually played out, May 7th to May 10th. The sources say the line of control just lit up with activity involving these new kinds of systems.
That's right. The sequence of events became a kind of case law, is how the source puts it, for AI in modern conflict. It kicked off with India launching Operation Sindoor.
which was retaliation for something that happened earlier in Kashmir.
Correct. And Pakistan's response was almost immediate.
So tell us about some of the specific clashes that really showed this new AI role, based on the sources.
Okay, one key event was the Harop attack. Before dawn, Indian forces sent in waves of these Harop loitering munitions.
The kamikaze drones, basically.
Yeah, essentially AI-guided kamikaze gliders. They had edge AI on board, fusing data from RF seekers.
Meaning they could find and target radar signals on their own.
Precisely. They could autonomously home in on Pakistani air defense radars the second those radars switched on.
Wow.
There's this one story in the sources. A Pakistani radar crew only survived because their generator just happened to fail at the exact moment a Harop was locking onto their signal. The radar went dead.
Just pure luck saved them from an AI-guided weapon. Incredible. How did Pakistan hit back?
They responded with what the sources called a drone flood. They used these Barak 2 quadcopters.
And these are the cheap ones you mentioned.
Relatively cheap, yeah. Costing about the same as a family car, apparently.
Okay.
They used onboard object detectors trained on local images to hunt for things like fuel trucks, maybe radar units, flying really low through mountain valleys by moonlight to stay off the radar.
Sneaky. How did India try to stop them?
Indian gunners used radar-guided shells. But here's the critical thing the sources point out. Each anti-aircraft shell cost way more than the drone it was trying to shoot down.
So that completely flips the usual cost dynamic. The defender ends up spending more than the attacker.
Exactly. A huge shift.
Okay, that was day one. What about day two? Anything significant?
Day 2 brought the Hypersonic Curveball. A Pakistani CM-400 AKG missile took out an Indian S-400 air defense site near Amritsar.
A hypersonic missile.
Yeah. Now, Pakistani pilots launched it, but its effectiveness really relied heavily on its Chinese-developed code.
How so?
It was sampling different trajectory options while flying mid-flight, and then performed this terminal dive maneuver that standard defense models just hadn't predicted.
Tactical surprise at Mach 5.
Yeah. Try defending against that. It's a whole different level of shock.
And all this kinetic stuff, the drones, the missile was happening alongside that information war you talked about.
Absolutely intertwined.
Okay.
The sources call it the data fog, narrative storm. While missiles are flying, platforms like Twitter, TikTok, Telegram are just drowning in deepfakes and automated garbage.
Any specific examples?
Yeah, there was one mention of a supposedly leaked phone call. An Indian general apparently begging for a ceasefire. It got millions of views almost instantly.
It wasn't real.
Nope. Open source intel folks eventually proved the voice was AI cloned. But by then, the damage was done. Both sides were denying things, blaming each other, posting counter-narratives within minutes of anything happening.
So truth just couldn't keep up.
Never stood a chance, as the source puts it, just lost in the noise.
So a short, incredibly intense conflict across physical and digital fronts. What was the overall impact when the ceasefire finally happened?
Well, physically, satellite analysis counted fewer than 100 fatalities, which is tragic, obviously, but, notably lower than some previous big clashes between them.
Okay.
But the sources really stress this. Almost every strategist they talked to felt the region had come closer to nuclear war than any time since 1999.
Wow. So lower immediate casualties, but much higher escalation risk. That's the paradox.
That's exactly the paradox of this kind of AI warfare. You get these potentially surgical strikes, maybe fewer bodies right away. But the speed of it all, the automation, it shrinks the time humans have to react. And then you add the bot-driven outrage online, cranking up public pressure on leaders.
A really dangerous feedback loop.
Incredibly volatile, yeah.
And this brief fight obviously didn't just stay contained in South Asia. The sources talk about reactions in Washington, Beijing, Moscow.
Oh, yeah, it definitely rattled the big capitals. Overnight, you saw things shift. In the U.S., Senate hearings suddenly went from talking about hypersonic parity to this new phrase, algorithmic overmatch.
Algorithmic overmatch, meaning...
Basically, who can process data and make decisions faster? The head of the Pentagon's AI office, CDAO, reportedly told Congress that losing the inference latency race, that speed race, could be like the new Sputnik moment.
A wake-up call.
A big one. And you know what follows that kind of talk? Budgets. Money started flowing fast.
So how did the major powers actually adjust their strategies after seeing this play out? What did the U.S. do?
So the U.S., according to the source, started integrating existing AI projects, like Project Maven, into a much broader algorithmic warfare strategy. DARPA ramped up funding for something called Rapid Missionized Autonomy.
Mhm.
Lockheed even showed off a Black Hawk helicopter flying a whole mission takeoff route, landing with zero pilot input.
Fully autonomous flight.
Now, officially, they still say a human has to okay lethal force.
Right, the human in the loop.
But insiders admitted that the software was sometimes, pre-populating engagement lists,
Mhm.
basically nudging the human decision pretty hard.
So the human's technically there, but the AI is really shaping the choices and the timing.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, what about China?
Beijing went big on industrial scale. You had consortiums in places like Shenzhen just churning out specialized vision chips optimized for drone swarms.
Mass production.
Massive, and that military-civil fusion thing was key. The sources point out that the same chips used in commercial delivery drones for companies like JD.com are now guiding PLA loitering munitions. The source quotes Xi Jinping calling AI warfare the decisive high ground, and they pledged to reach parity in smart weapons by 2027.
Treating defense tech like consumer electronics, iterating that fast, really changes the game.
Totally changes the timelines.
And Russia, what was their angle?
Well, their war in Ukraine was basically a real-time R&D lab. They saw firsthand how effective these FPV drones, especially with AI-assisted aiming, could be against dug-in positions.
Burning on the fly.
Absolutely. And their export brochures quickly started advertising battle-tested autonomy kits. Even with sanctions making chips harder to get, they found creative ways to keep development and production going.
And the truly fascinating part.
Across all these big powers, US, China, Russia, was how fast the lessons learned in one place, like the India-Pakistan clash or Ukraine, just jumped borders.
Right.
They were appearing in other military strategies way faster than traditional intelligence gathering ever allowed.
A global, real-time feedback loop for AI conflict. It's already here.
Seems like it, yeah.
Okay, let's zoom back to Pakistan after the ceasefire. What was their big takeaway? How did they adjust?
Islamabad felt, well, relieved it was short, obviously, but also, according to sources, kind of emboldened. They felt their use of asymmetric AI applications had been pretty successful.
Okay.
Their defense brief to parliament basically argued that the fight proved smaller countries could get big results by using brains over bulk.
Leveraging tech instead of just matching numbers.
Exactly. Using AI smarts instead of trying to match India tank for tank, plane for plane.
Yeah.
And their funding priorities shifted pretty dramatically because of it.
Towards what specifically?
A few key areas. Developing indigenous vision labs, places like New West University were tasked with creating their own object detection code, reducing reliance on foreign software for critical stuff.
Makes sense.
Setting up a joint drone factory with Turkey's Baykar to build advanced Anka-Il drone variants right there in Pakistan.
Building local capacity.
Yeah. And significantly, the Air Force signed a big data sharing agreement with China's PLA Air Force.
We're changing what kind of data?
Things like radar cross-section libraries for Indian drones and missiles. Valuable intelligence.
That data sharing deal sounds like it could tie Pakistan even closer to Beijing.
Well, the sources mentioned critics definitely raised that concern, getting locked into China's tech ecosystem.
But the planners had a counter-argument.
They basically said, look, strategic autonomy needs technological depth somewhere, and the U.S. just wasn't offering it at the level or the speed they needed.
Speed again.
Speed is crucial. There's this really powerful anecdote in the source material. A Pakistani pilot describing an engagement.
Yeah.
He said he had just 8 seconds to decide if an incoming radar blip was a real threat like a missile or just a drone decoy.
8 seconds.
8 seconds. His targeting pod's neural net gave him a confidence score. 0.83, meaning likely hostile. He fired.
And did he double-check?
He admitted, quote, I'd be lying if I said I double-checked the AI in that time. There just wasn't time.
Wow, that perfectly illustrates the speed problem, doesn't it? The shrinking decision window.
It absolutely crystallizes it. That's AI warfare right there. Decision loops so fast that human judgment risks becoming just ceremonial, a rubber stamp.
Unless you deliberately build in slowdowns.
Unless you consciously design systems with checks, with verification steps, yeah.
And this acceleration is clearly being fueled by the tech itself. The sources describe the Defense Expo scene in 2025 as feeling like CES with camouflage.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Every booth was pushing something smart, something autonomous.
What kinds of hardware really stood out?
Several key types. Loitering munitions were everywhere, things like the Harop NG, the Warmate 3. They've got autopilots running these convolutional networks to spot tank silhouettes.
So the operator just sees a box on a screen.
Pretty much. Sees a green box, confirms the target, taps, send on a tablet. Done.
Simple but deadly. What else?
Swarming quadcopters, like the Burak 2 or the Kargu 3. These are cheap to build, but the code behind them is complex. They use mesh radios to share what they see, so the whole swarm acts like one big distributed brain.
The swarm as a single entity. That's powerful and kind of terrifying.
Definitely. Then you had hypersonic glide vehicles like the upgraded CM-400, still Mach 5 plus TPC, but now using neural nets to adjust tiny control surfaces, micro-11s, mid-flight to dodge interceptors.
AI playing defense avoidance at hypersonic speeds.
Yeah,
Wow.
and directed energy air defense.
Yeah.
Systems like Iron Beam or Dragonfire, they use AI vision to lock onto plastic drones that radar struggles to track reliably. Beam pulses, drone down.
Okay, and autonomous ships too.
Autonomous surface vessels, yeah. They're adapting the collision avoidance algorithms that commercial ships use and turning them into target classification modules, so the vessel itself might decide if that contact is just a fishing boat or maybe a minesweeper before it even flags it to a human.
Taking the analysis step further. And finally, were there tools emerging to counter all this AI?
Yes, definitely. The sources mention counter-AI toolkits, things like the US Project Anvil or China's ZPZ Shield.
What do they do?
They're basically software designed to fool or spoof an enemy's AI classifiers. The example given was changing just 3 pixels on a camouflage tarp covering a tank.
Just 3 pixels.
Yeah. Enough to make an enemy drone's vision system classify it as, say, a farm tractor instead of a tank.
Adversarial AI, basically.
Exactly. But the big takeaway from the hardware scene, the sources emphasize, is that militaries aren't waiting for some perfect, grand, fully integrated AI system.
No.
No, they're buying what the source calls Lego boxes of autonomy.
Lego boxes.
Yeah, little AI modules, sensors, processors, and they're just lashing them onto existing planes, tanks, ships, and calling it modernization.
Which fuels that rapid feedback loop you mentioned. Algorithms spreading everywhere, maybe without enough testing or oversight.
That's the worry, yeah. Very patchwork, very fast.
The sources highlighted some specific Chinese innovations, too, and how they're developing this tech. Tell us about their adaptive hypersonics approach.
Right, this really shows the development speed. In Xi'an, there's a joint lab using reinforcement learning AI agents to tune the control systems for hypersonic fins on the fly.
How does that work?
Okay, so they do a test launch. They collect all the flight data, the telemetry. They feed that back into the AI agent. The AI updates its policy, its strategy for controlling the missile. They flash that updated code onto the missile's hardware, and it's ready for the next test launch.
And the turnaround time for that whole cycle?
Under a week.
Under a week. To update the core guidance of a hypersonic missile.
Exactly. As one Chinese colonel reportedly told observers, we iterate missiles like software, not hardware.
That just completely blows up traditional defense procurement cycles that take years, right?
Completely upends it. If your adversary can update a warhead's brain as often as you update your phone's apps, well, your old deterrence models based on known fixed capabilities start looking pretty shaky.
Yeah, really hard to keep track. And then at the other end of the scale, you mentioned Russia's approach using more off-the-shelf tech.
Yeah, the sort of export-grade AI warfare idea. Despite sanctions, Russia saw volunteers in Ukraine hacking together things like GoPros and Raspberry Pis.
Stuff you can just buy online.
Right. Into really effective FPV kamikaze drones for hitting trenches. But the really significant part is what happened next.
What's that?
The code, the software for many of these DIY drone projects, it leaked, it got forked on GitHub, it was quickly translated into Arabic, Urdu, other languages.
Oh, it spread virally.
Exactly. And within weeks, you had militia engineers in places like the Sahel, 3D printing parts for the same kinds of AI-assisted drones that were being used near Kharkiv just a short time before.
That really brings home that democratization point. It's not just states anymore.
It really does. It's the dark side of democratization, though. Capabilities aren't just flowing top-down from big powers through official sales anymore. They're rippling sideways. Viral, cheap, available to almost anyone with decent tech skills and an internet connection. Containment, as the source says, containment is pretty much done.
Okay, let's swing back to India. After the shock of that CM-400 strike and dealing with those drone floods, how did they change their strategy?
Well, the Indian Air Force, as the sources put it, really doesn't like surprises. So their main R&D agency, DRDO, responded by shifting funding significantly towards 3 main areas to counter these new threats.
Okay, what were they?
First, Swarm killer lasers. They started prototyping these 50-kilowatt fiber laser arrays.
Designed specifically for drones.
Exactly. Designed to target and take down those small plastic body drones at a distance. Machine vision locks on, laser pulses, drone drops.
Okay, lasers. What else?
Second, homegrown autonomy. Pouring money into startups, particularly in Bengaluru, to train vision networks specifically on the Himalayan terrain.
Why the specific terrain?
So their own combat drones can hug the local ravines and valleys better, making them harder for Pakistani radar or defenses to spot, tailoring the AI locally.
Makes sense. And the third area?
A big push on data-centric operations. Basically, getting much, much faster at fusing sensor data from all kinds of different sources, satellites, aircraft, ground sensors, into one coherent picture.
So lasers, local AI, and faster data fusion. India frames this as defensive, naturally.
Of course. But just as naturally, Pakistan sees these new capabilities and interprets them as potentially offensive as escalation.
And the cycle continues.
And the spiral continues, yeah.
Now, speaking of data, Pakistan's strategy, given they maybe have fewer resources than India, it sounds like they're really leaning on leveraging data and code to get that asymmetric advantage.
That's absolutely core to their approach, as detailed in the source. Instead of matching platform for platform, they're investing heavily in software, in cloud infrastructure.
Like what?
They're building something called a national inference grid. Think of it as a network of shipping containers packed with GPUs located near places like Peshawar.
Okay, what's the goal?
The goal is to rapidly suck in and process surveillance feeds from Turkish drones, maybe Chinese fighter pods, ground sensors, all in one place, really fast.
Centralized AI processing.
Yeah. And they're also focusing on edge AI retrofits, adding modern AI processing modules onto older drones, like their Shapar UAVs.
So they can do more on their own.
Exactly. So they can navigate autonomously, maybe identify targets, even if their satellite communication links get jammed. Classic asymmetric tactics.
Allowing a mid-tier power to punch above its weight in an AI fight without breaking the bank on brand new hardware.
That's the idea, yeah. Using code as a force multiplier.
But this sheer speed of development, the low cost, how fast these capabilities are spreading,
Yeah.
it really sounds like it's completely outpacing any efforts to create international rules or guardrails.
Oh, absolutely. The sources suggest that by mid-2025, international workshops in Geneva, places like that, they were just struggling.
Trying to catch up.
Trying desperately to draft regulations that weren't already out of date by the time the ink was dry. The conflict really threw several ethical flashpoints around autonomous weapons into sharp relief.
What were those main points of concern that the sources raised?
Okay, first, meaningful human control. Everyone still talks about it, right? Doctrine writers insist a human must always be in the loop for killing decisions.
Yeah.
But commanders on the ground, under incredible pressure, with these tiny time windows we talked about, they're shaving off seconds wherever they possibly can.
So the gap between theory and practice is widening.
Significantly, the sources argue. That 8-second pilot story really hammers it home.
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah.
What's the second flashpoint?
Attribution. This is a big one. Say a loitering munition misidentifies a civilian truck as a military target.
Yeah.
But the human operator never actually saw the raw video because the AI chip made the final classification decision that led to the strike. Who's responsible? Our traditional legal frameworks rely a lot on intent, right? But lines of code don't exactly testify in court.
Right. So assigning blame, achieving accountability in these super fast automated kill chains, it becomes incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible.
That's a really chilling thought, especially for things like war crimes investigations. And the third flashpoint.
Proliferation. We touched on this. The core AI components, vision models, GPUs, they're fundamentally dual use.
Meaning they have civilian uses too.
Exactly. So traditional export controls, like banning the sale of specific military hardware, they just don't work very well here.
Because the building blocks are everywhere.
Pretty much. If you stop a military getting, say, a high-end graphics card, the sources point out someone will just figure out how to cluster together powerful chips from gaming laptops or even smartphones.
So you can't really control the spread of the basic tech needed for AI economy.
It's almost impossible, as the sources say on this point. The genie laughs.
Yeah, the genie definitely seems to be out of the bottle there. There's that quote from a Pakistani diplomat in the source. We must talk norms before the tech outpaces our ability to panic. That feels spot on. It feels incredibly urgent, doesn't it, given everything we've just discussed? And looking ahead, the sources sketch out about 7 potential scenarios for where AI warfare might go by 2030.
Okay.
suggesting the future really depends on whether we manage to govern this stuff or just let it run wild.
What are some of those possible futures? Give us a taste.
Well, there's swarm saturation, armies fielding just tens of thousands of cheap, disposable drones. Defense becomes all about just trying to stop the swarm.
A numbers game with robots.
Pretty much. There's orbital autonomy, AI-guided microsatellites constantly shadowing rival satellites, making the first actual shooting war in space feel almost inevitable.
Grim.
And maybe the scariest. Nuclear tripwires. Automated early warning systems, AI analysis shrinking human reaction time so much that leaders might face use it or lose it nuclear decisions measured in just minutes, massively increasing the risk of accidental nuclear war.
That's terrifying. Just automated escalation right up to the nuclear level. Are there any less terrifying scenarios?
There are a couple. One is called peacetime deterrent apps, using predictive AI, analyzing huge amounts of data to spot crises brewing before they explode.
Like an early warning system for conflict itself.
Yeah, maybe pushing diplomatic alerts straight to leaders' phones, trying to head off escalation. On the flip side, though, there's algorithmic mercenaries.
What's that?
Private companies leasing out battlefield AI capabilities as a service. War becomes like subscription-based?
Or as a service. Wow, that's bleak.
Isn't it? And another really concerning one, bioconvergence, where advanced AI in lab automation meets cutting-edge biotech tools, potentially making engineered pathogens spread silently, the next AI-driven weapon.
Oh, man.
The most hopeful one mentioned is regulated calm, where somehow the international community actually manages to agree on and enforce a binding treaty.
Banning what?
Maybe banning fully autonomous attacks on civilians, for instance.
Yeah.
Potentially enforced using tech like cryptographic watermarks on AI decisions or public transparency tools.
A lot rests on achieving something like that regulated calm scenario, doesn't it?
It feels like it. Though the sources note, history suggests we'll probably end up with a messy mix of several of these scenarios happening all at once.
Yeah, reality is rarely that neat. Bringing it back to India and Pakistan, despite all this rapid tech development and strategic shifting, the sources mention a kind of unease among the public in both countries.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, both governments are pushing AI skills like crazy. You see defense AI minors at universities, hackathons simulating drone tactics, young programmers realizing their code might end up in a weapon system.
So there's national pride in the tech.
For sure, pride in the tech prowess, a sense of strength. But people also remember those jets screaming over Islamabad. They saw the news reports, refugees fleeing border areas to get away from loitering munitions.
So the human cost is still felt, even if the casualty numbers were lower this time.
Absolutely. There is a psychological weight. The sources mention civil society groups like in Lahore actually partnering with NGOs in New Delhi.
Working together across the border.
Yeah, advocating for a joint pledge, no first use of fully autonomous missiles. Got a lot of traction online, especially on Pakistani Twitter.
Did it go anywhere officially?
Reportedly died quietly in government backrooms. But the petitions are still out there, still circulating. It shows public pressure can still try to find ways to make itself heard, even on tough security issues.
So whether you're watching those jets, like that engineer, or you're tracking defense budgets in Washington or Beijing, the message from the sources seems crystal clear. Artificial intelligence isn't theoretical anymore. It's on the firing line.
It really is. It can influence borders. It can escalate crises incredibly fast. And yeah, it could light fuses that diplomats just can't put out if we're not extremely careful.
But the sources also say we do have tools to manage this.
They emphasize that, yes, tools exist. Things like digital watermarks to trace AI-generated data or decisions back to their source. Latency locks deliberately building pauses into systems to force human review time. Even shared test ranges, where potential adversaries could test AI systems transparently to build some confidence and reduce misunderstanding.
Practical measures, not necessarily fancy tech.
Not glamorous, no, but they're designed to put time and therefore power back into human hands.
But they need people to champion them. Right. To actually push for them to be implemented.
Precisely. They need champions. In the labs, in governments, maybe even among military commanders themselves, it's hard work building these guardrails, the source acknowledges. But it's way easier than cleaning up the mess after AI swarms go wrong or trying to figure out who to blame when attribution becomes impossible.
So AI warfare isn't going away. As the source says, the Genie grants neither wishes nor do-overs.
Nope. It's here.
What the sources really leave us with, it seems, is the need to, well, teach AI some respect, maybe. Wrap it in rules we can actually understand and enforce.
And critically, always ensure there's that steady human hand on the last switch.
Right. But given everything we've talked about, the speed, the shrinking reaction times, what does it actually mean anymore? Keeping a steady human hand on the last switch.
That's the question, isn't it? It's definitely something for you, for all of us, to think about the next time we hear about the latest AI breakthrough.